careful. Governor Andrew Bailey was blunt. We're not out of the woods yet. James Smith is developed market economist at ING. So James, what are the dangers that the Bank of England see ahead?
Well, merely that inflation is still very high. It's pretty close to 4%. Could creep slightly higher from here. Certainly it's going to stay above 3.5% for the end of the year, into the end of the year, and that's uncomfortable territory.
Bank of England's rate dilemma, the political storm brewing. Right, let's get straight to it. If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button because what I'm about to reveal about the Bank of England's latest monetary maneuvering will absolutely shock you. And frankly, it should terrify every British taxpayer watching this. The numbers don't lie, but the politicians certainly do. Here's what they don't want you to know. Whilst you're struggling to pay your mortgage, fill your petrol tank, and keep the heating on, the Bank of England is playing a dangerous game of economic chess with your financial future as the stakes. And the latest inflation figures? They are nothing short of a bloody disaster wrapped in bureaucratic doublespeak. Let me paint you the picture they are desperately trying to hide. The August inflation data has just landed, and it's stuck at what economists are politely calling uncomfortably high rates. Uncomfortable? That's rather like calling the Titanic's voyage a minor navigational hiccup, isn't it? The consumer price index is sitting considerably above the bank's target level, and here's the kicker. The Monetary Policy Committee is about to make decisions that could either save or sink millions of British households. But here's where it gets absolutely fascinating and frankly infuriating. Sandra Horsfield from Investec, and she's no amateur in these matters, has just dropped a bombshell that should have every political correspondent scrambling for their notebooks. She's stating categorically that the possibility of a rate drop this week was already remote. But beyond that, the MPC believes they need to see genuine evidence of falling inflation before they'll even consider additional rate reductions. Translation? You're going to be paying through the nose for considerably longer than anyone's been willing to admit publicly. Now, let's talk about what this really means to the average British family, because the political implications are staggering. When economists predict that the MPC may refrain from lowering interest rates at both the November and December meetings, potentially holding rates steady until February, they're essentially telling you that your mortgage payment will remain punishingly high through Christmas and into the new year. Imagine explaining that to families already choosing between heating and eating. But here's what's truly maddening about this entire charade. The political establishment has spent months promising relief, suggesting that rate cuts were just around the corner, painting rosy pictures of economic recovery. Meanwhile, the technocrats at Threadneedle Street have been looking at the same data and reaching entirely different conclusions. Someone's been telling porkies, and it isn't the economists. The political ramifications of this are absolutely enormous, and I suspect most MPs haven't even begun to grasp what's coming. We're looking at a scenario where interest rates remain elevated just as we head into the most expensive months of the year. Energy bills are already astronomical, food prices remain stubbornly high, and now mortgage holders are being told to buckle up for at least another 4 months of financial pain. This isn't just an economic issue, it's becoming a political crisis of confidence. Let's examine the broader context, because this inflation persistence isn't happening in a vacuum. We've had years of unprecedented monetary expansion, government spending that would make a sailor blush, and policy decisions that prioritize short-term political gain over long-term economic stability. Now we're seeing the chickens coming home to roost. And guess who's paying the price? Not the politicians who created this mess, that's for certain. The Bank of England finds itself in an impossible position, caught between the political pressure to provide relief and the economic reality that premature rate cuts could reignite inflationary pressures. It's rather like trying to perform surgery with a sledgehammer whilst politicians shout instructions from a gallery. The independence of the bank, once considered sacrosanct, is now being tested in ways that would make previous governors break out in cold sweats. But here's what's really keeping me awake at night, and should be keeping you awake too. This situation is creating a perfect storm of political instability. When mortgage holders realize their payments aren't coming down anytime soon, when renters discover landlords are passing on higher financing costs, when businesses start laying off workers because borrowing costs remain prohibitive, where do you think that frustration is going to be directed? The political calculus becomes fascinating when you consider the electoral timeline. If rates don't drop until February, and it takes months for any benefits to filter through to household budgets, we're looking at a scenario where the economic pain continues well into the political cycle. Opposition parties are already sharpening their knives, and frankly, Who can blame them? This is political ammunition delivered on a silver platter. What's particularly galling is the disconnect between the political rhetoric and economic reality. Ministers continue to speak about turning corners and seeing light at the end of tunnels, whilst the actual data suggests we're nowhere near the exit. The August inflation figures that Horsfield referenced aren't just disappointing. They're a stark reminder that the underlying economic fundamentals remain deeply problematic. The housing market is already showing signs of stress, with mortgage approvals declining and house prices beginning to wobble in certain regions. Commercial property is facing similar pressures, and the ripple effects are starting to impact everything from high street retail to office construction. Yet somehow, the political narrative remains stubbornly optimistic, as if wishful thinking could overcome economic gravity. Here's what I find most troubling about this entire situation: the complete lack of honest communication with the British public. Instead of preparing people for the reality of sustained high rates, we had months of hints and suggestions that relief was imminent. Now, faced with the harsh reality that inflation remains sticky and rate cuts off the table, there's a scramble to manage expectations and shift blame. The international context makes this even more complex. Central banks across the developed world are grappling with similar challenges, but the UK's unique post-Brexit economic structure adds layers of complexity that other nations don't face. Our trade relationships, labor market dynamics, and fiscal constraints create a perfect storm of inflationary pressures that can't be wished away with clever political messaging. Small businesses are particularly vulnerable in this environment. Many expanded during the low-rate environment of recent years, taking on debt that seemed manageable when borrowing costs were near zero. Now they are facing a brutal combination of higher financing costs, reduced consumer spending, and ongoing supply chain disruptions. The political implications when these businesses start failing en masse will be severe. The generational impact cannot be ignored either. Young people already struggling to get onto the property ladder are seeing their dreams recede even further as mortgage rates remain elevated. First-time buyers who stretched themselves to purchase homes in recent years are now facing payment shock as their fixed-rate deals expire. This isn't just an economic issue. It's creating a generation of voters who feel completely abandoned by the political system. What's particularly insidious is how this situation disproportionately affects working families whilst leaving the wealthy relatively unscathed. Those with significant assets benefit from higher returns on savings and investments, whilst those dependent on borrowed money bear the full brunt of policy decisions. The political optics of this are toxic, and opposition parties would be foolish not to exploit the growing sense of unfairness. The credibility of economic forecasting is also taking a battering. How many times have we been told that inflation was transitory, that rate cuts were imminent, that recovery was just around the corner? Each failed prediction erodes public trust not just in economists, but in the entire political establishment that relies on their analysis to justify policy decisions. Looking ahead to the November and December MPC meetings, the political pressure will be intense. MPs facing angry constituents, businesses threatening closures, and mortgage holders demanding action will be beating down Downing Street's door. Yet the bank's independence means political pressure should theoretically be irrelevant to their decision-making process. The tension between democratic accountability and technocratic expertise has never been more apparent. The broader question this raises about British economic governance is profound. If elected politicians can't directly influence monetary policy, yet are held accountable for its effects, we have a fundamental disconnect in our democratic system. Voters can't punish the MPC at a ballot box, but they can certainly punish the government that appointed them. What makes this situation even more politically volatile is the timing. We're heading into winter, traditionally the most expensive time of year for household budgets. Energy costs will spike, Christmas spending will strain finances further, and those higher mortgage and loan payments will hit just as families are already under maximum financial pressure. The political party in power during this period will own this crisis, fairly or not. The international implications shouldn't be underestimated either. A UK struggling with persistent inflation and high interest rates looks increasingly like an outlier among developed economies. This affects everything from foreign investment to diplomatic relationships, as other nations question Britain's economic management and political stability. Here's the brutal truth they don't want you to understand. We're witnessing the consequences of years of economic and political short-termism coming home to roost simultaneously. The decision to maintain ultra-low rates for years, the massive fiscal expansion during the pandemic, The Brexit disruption to trade relationships and the failure to address underlying productivity issues have created a perfect storm that can't be resolved with clever political messaging or wishful thinking. The MPC's reluctance to cut rates reflect a harsh reality that politicians are desperately trying to avoid acknowledging. The UK economy is in a fundamentally different place than most people understand. The inflation we're experiencing isn't just a temporary blip that can be wished away. It reflects structural changes in the economy that require sustained high rates to address. This creates an almost impossible political situation. Acknowledge the reality and face voter fury over broken promises and economic pain. Continue the optimistic messaging and face credibility destruction when the promised relief fails to materialize. Either path leads to political damage, which explains the current scramble to find someone else to blame. So there you have it. The Bank of England's rate dilemma isn't just an economic story. It's a political crisis that will reshape British politics for years to come. The decisions made in those November and December meetings won't just affect mortgage rates. They'll determine which political careers survive and which parties benefit from the inevitable voter backlash. And if you think this is complicated now, wait until you see what happens when the full political and economic consequences start to unfold. The truth is, we're just getting started, and the political establishment is nowhere near prepared for what's coming. Make sure you're subscribed because this story is far from over, and the next few months are going to be absolutely fascinating to watch unfold.